back everybody, and today we are going to be looking at alternative paint schemes for weaponry in Warhammer 40k. And the reason we tripped upon this grand idea was that courtesy of Warhammer providing a model of the month each month, and for the month of July we got the Infernus Marine with a Pyreblaster. And looking closely at that weapon, it just seemed to remind me of the weaponry used in District 9, specifically the AMR B05, the repeater weapon, and just the shape, the canister, the overall sort of appearance of the weapon. I thought, wow, that does look like the Pyreblaster to some extent. I wonder if we can paint it up that way. I don't think I've seen anyone do anything like that as such, so that seemed like a great place to start. And beginning with a base coat of black. I did have an undercoat black on one of the models, some of the others not so. So to start with, just using primarily Citadel paints for all of this, grabbed the Abaddon black and painted that onto the body of the weapon to give it a black background, and then grabbed Corax white to put it mostly on the casings and part of the grip of the weapon and also the canister. And then to provide the color highlights, using Trollslayer orange on select pieces of the weaponry, particularly the main grip and the ring around the canister, and also just that little square underneath part of the mechanism, just to provide that contrasting. And a few coats of that, because clearly the orange doesn't cover particularly well. You've got to build it up. And then using lead belcher on the sort of the protective casing, the screening over the barrel itself, and just apply that over the whole piece. And then use highlights either end, a bit like the reference art, only using canoptic alloy to sort of give it more of a brassy sort of appearance, just to provide a bit of detail to the weapon. And then again using Abaddon black, and this time using a sponge to introduce some chips and damage, also using a paintbrush to do some edge markings as well to make it look like the paint has scraped off, and that provides a bit of a weathering. And ultimately the goal is to also put a bit of a wash over this, so the depth of the color isn't so crucial, because we're trying to go for that grim dark aesthetic and make it look a little bit dark and dingy. So we're not after perfection or full coverage on all the paint layers, so that hopefully gives it the appearance that we're looking for at the end. And the application of the Nuln oil does just that. It dirties it up a little. I did use it slightly diluted so that I could push it around a little and have a bit more control over where the darkness sat. So a couple of applications of that just to make it pool, to provide that sort of murky look, is exactly what we were chasing. And obviously once we had the Pyreblaster done, it was like, okay, well, can we extend this color scheme to some of the other weaponry, particularly just on the standard assault intercessors, such as their chainswords and bolters. So sticking with the same color scheme, starting with Corax white, just as a base on the blade of the chainsword, and the hilt and handle just in Abaddon black, and picking again the details such as the casing in the Trollslayer orange. Now I thought I'd get a little bit creative, given that the weaponry does have markings. They seem to use a fair bit of orange and black striping on the weapon case itself, and I thought maybe I can try masking up and putting some marks onto the blade of the chainsword. And just a simple matter of getting some painting masking tape and cutting thin strips of that and applying it to the chainsword to mask off the areas that I didn't want to paint. And again going with orange this time, so the Trollslayer orange as the sort of highlight colors, And rather than paint it on with a brush, I'm using the sort of the stippling sponge method because it creates a bit of texture and it's not uniform and homogeneous. What I want is to make it look like it's partially weathered and worn off. And so 3 applications of the orange creates a bit of a build-up that is still patchy in part, so it looks like it's sort of fatigued. And also doing the same with the black, putting a tip on there that wraps around the front. And after I'd done the first trial, I thought, oh, I think the angle of the orange stripe should actually be the opposite direction at the front, and so I just remasked that up and just sort of filled in that small section to create the direction that I wanted. Now, when I initially did this, I did go for placing it in the middle. I did a subsequent model and actually moved that more to the bottom of the sword. I guess it just comes down to aesthetics. You can play with it as you see fit. It was just my choice at the time. Unfortunately, using the masking tape is not the world's greatest, and there is a bit of bleed, as you can see, getting underneath the tape. And so I just went back in again with a bit of tape over the orange that I'd done and just grabbed a brush and sort of covered over the sections that sort of had bled through to reinstate the white. And looking at the model reference of the weapon, there was a sort of a distinct black line towards the top, and I thought perhaps if I do the spine of the sword continuous black, that might look better than keeping it all white. So I did a couple of alternative options when I was trialing this sort of scheme, and again went in to sponge to put on the black paint over the blade. And you can see there's a little bit of orange and black also on the actual teeth of the sword. So I went in with the lead belcher and detailed those again. And towards the end I actually used a bit of Stormhorst silver just as a bit of an edge highlight on those blades to make them look a little bit brighter. But ultimately just going in and adding edge detailing to give it that weathered, fatigued look. And then it was on to the bolter to see what options we could get there, and again basing with Abaddon black just to give it a nice dark background to keep it consistent with everything else. And therefore the next colour that we're going to go in with is the Corax white, this time on part of the sort of the lower magazine holding section and the rear carriage of the gun. And that's just there again, artistic choice as to what might be the right sort of combination of colours here, but it seems to work relatively well, and I'm just keeping it somewhat consistent. So just applying that there and doing a shocking job of it, and then going in and sort of having to sort of clean some of that off with a little bit of a damp brush rather than having to paint everything over twice. But these things happen. You only use fat brushes apparently. But ultimately paint it up white, get the finish that we're looking for, and then choose which way to detail. Now obviously I chose the main grip in orange on the Pyreblaster, so my plan was to do exactly the same on the bolter and keep that uniformity running through. And again, it's just a case of putting on a few thin coats to build it up progressively. And it does take probably 2 to 3 to get a reasonable sort of coverage, which is still somewhat see-through. You can it's not completely orange, but again, going for the grim dark aesthetic, it doesn't matter too much if it's a bit murky and muddy, because we're going to be going back over these again using the Nuln oil and dull everything down with a bit of a coating, and that'll sort of disguise some of that irregularity in the paint finish. Now the muzzle of the gun and the barrel, just used lead belcher on that just to provide a bit of contrast, and that works relatively well. I did then subsequently go in with some of the Canoptic alloy and just put a little bit of a coloration on the tip, much like we did for the sort of the barrel cover on the Pyreblaster, just to sort of again keep everything looking the same. And then going in and doing the chipping with Abaddon black and a relatively dry sponge, and then making the sort of the fatigue be more obvious, particularly on the sort of the casing of the gun itself. And again, using the Stormhorse silver, because it's a nice bright looking silver rather than the lead belcher, so it just has a bit more pop. We're not trying to use too much of it, it's just a very subtle application to provide that sort of look. And then just quickly apply the Nuln oil. It does produce a sort of a slick kind of greasy finish on the model, but it's not the end of the world. I guess if you don't like that color, you could actually go in with wash something like just using a sienna ink or something like burnt sienna ink, and that would probably do the same sort of thing. But I just wanted to give this a bit of a trial. And at the end of the day, we have a group of little guys standing around with somewhat distinct looking weapons, and they do seem to work relatively well, particularly with the sort of the blues and the greens of these particular guys. Only the middle one was finished. The other two, I just did the weapons first, but I thought I'll just put them all together so you get to see the Intercessors with our Infernus Marine to get an idea of what the group of weaponry does look like together. So all in all, it seems to have a similar sort of aesthetic to the District 9 weaponry. It certainly stands out rather than being dull. I guess it depends on what your position is, whether you want to emphasize the weapons or the actual guy. But I do think they're a bit of a focal point and they look quite good. So anyway, that's what we decided to do. So I'm glad you could join us for this little sort of trial on color schemes of weapons. And hope you liked it, and hope to see you in the next one. Thank you.